I really am very delighted to be here for a number of reasons. It's really exciting to talk to other Brown alum, to talk to such a wide range of the intersections of the Brown community, which I think we need to do more of and be in sort of as much conversation about these types of issues together as much as we can. Because it's a particularly fascinating contradiction that we live in, where we talk constantly about the notion of being a multiracial society and having transcended a variety of matters related to inequality, although we haven't transcended anything about class, but when it comes to race, we're very open about that. And yet we find ourselves exchanging ideas virtually. Very rarely in the same space, very rarely about some of the tough subjects, and certainly not sufficiently enough about the things that we share cross-racially. Now let me just explain what I mean by that. We talk about larger issues, say if this were healthcare talk, we could all be in here and talk about healthcare. But to talk about race or about gender in a mixed, multiracial, multigendered, multi-orientation community is a much harder thing to pull off, because what we actually share on those subjects is popular culture more than anything else. We don't actually share lived experience nearly as much as we think we do across race. We all have friends of different backgrounds. Don't have that thought, I know. I've heard it, said it. We all, I have a friend who, that's not what I mean. I have 3 friends who, that's not what I mean. 11 friends, I can keep counting, it doesn't change my point, which is to say that we exchange the most cultural knowledge about race through popular culture. We think we know each other through it. So when a friend or colleague of mine the other day says, "Oh, can I call you Shorty?" I'm like, I'm 5'8", probably not a good plan. What do you mean, call me Shorty? Again, who taught you that, I'm like, where'd you learn that? It doesn't look like you heard that where it comes from. It's kind of like an MTV moment gone wild. So it comes to us in this complex mediated way. And that would be okay too if we had the level of cultural knowledge and literacy that we need to unpack our cultural complexity. We come from so many different traditions that we are constantly morphing and changing and transforming, that to bring a kind of simple, mainstream, usually shallow conception of all of this is very troubling to the exchange. And that's really one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we're all here. And I'm thrilled that the Boston Club here has brought this together in consolidation and coordination with more acronyms than you're ever going to hear me repeat. So keep up the good collaborative work, and I'm going to try to sustain this process in how I talk about this subject. So I want you to think about both what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, because they're intended to complement each other. It's not just the subject, but how I want to talk about it. So let me back up a little bit to the Elizabeth Weed days of hip hop, which is to say sort of how I got into it. I mean, the irony of it is that I didn't actually get into it while I was in the Bronx, because first of all, you didn't attend to things like that as a teenager. It is what it is. It's not a thing to study, it's something you do. And hip hop really begins in the mid-1970s. There's a lot of debates about origins, so don't really just say mid-1970s. That's good enough for now. And the Bronx is usually considered the indisputable home. So I did not make that up. It existed before I got to say it. And I was in high school at the time. And I paid no attention to it particularly, meaning I listened to it. I was actually a basketball player, which for a girl in that era was far more unusual than now. There was just Nancy Lieberman, for those of you who know this. And she didn't play with anybody because just a bunch of guys pick up. I mean, there was no place for her to play, pretty much. There was no, like, WNBA for you younger people. It's like that new place where girls play basketball. Didn't exist. So I was on the basketball courts a lot, which again was unusual. But that's really where hip hop was mostly practiced. If it wasn't a party itself, a full-out block party, it was on basketball courts where B-sides of disco records would be placed on one cassette, a dual cassette player. One would be the B-side, the other side would be whose ever rap or rhyme that they had created, and they did it simultaneously. So this is very crude. So you take your B-side of, Chic, Good Times, for those of you who need a particular memory, And so the B-side would play forever, 15, 20 minutes long. This was disco. And the other one would be a blank tape, and you would rap over, you would dub yourself onto the blank tape while the B-side was playing. Oh, that's the first mix, basically. That's pretty much how it happened. So there'd be these elaborate sessions where you would then listen to yourself, or someone else would then tape over you, and people would, see if they won the next match and game. Would they get out and play, or would they actually stay in and play? It would all depend on how successful their rhyme was. So there was a lot of casual play going on. It was not in any way meant to be a sort of elaborate practice in mainstream American culture at this point. The other key thing about this early period of hip-hop was the profoundly fascinating reuse of technology. And really what hip-hop does in this era that still hasn't, to my mind, been adequately explored and talked about and really studied is the way in which it changed the entire relationship we have to pre-recorded sound. And pre-recorded sound as a baseline, as a set of ideas from which to build new songs. Now, musicians do this all the time. They've done it. Musical borrowing goes back thousands of years. This is not brand new. But to use pre-recorded, already seemingly sealed and finite music, and to pull sections out, musical sections, passages, and to turn those sections into new songs was the result of a few things together. And I'm going to lay just 2 or 3 of them out because they're going to come back in when we get to hip-hop today. One is the access to technology. New technology that allowed for the deconstruction of records, right? You can't, before that, you just clink, 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 that was it. You couldn't do anything, it was what it was, you had to play it. Then when samplers come around and other deconstructive sound equipment comes around, you can take bass lines out, harmonies, melodies, and separate them from the record. You can repeat them, you can play them backwards, you can change the key, you can stutter them, you can do all kinds of things with them. So there's one, just the sheer technological transformation. The second thing is a long tradition in the Afro-diaspora community where the notion of versioning, the notion of borrowing, the notion of treatment, which means originality rests in how you create within the context of existing musical ideas. How you create in the context of existing musical ideas. Think of the blues. You could start a blues song right now. I guarantee you it probably already exists, but it'll be yours and you'll do something interesting. And that will continue. That idea that you stole this other blues song would be irrational inside of the tradition of the blues and of most black music, frankly. And so the idea that you take here, for example, in Jamaica, there are about 195 versions of Tracy Chapman's song, I'm Sorry. For some reason, that song was a big, big hit. Remember the song, I'm sorry, na, na, na. Right, okay. 198 versions. You get the little bit of it, right? 198 versions. Is it that Jamaican people don't have a song to sing? And that all they want to do is repeat Tracy Chapman? Obviously not. It's in what's called versioning or treatment. Dig Heb Dija, not structuralist, but a postmodern writer and thinker of music, has really written quite a bit on this very subject and made it clear that versioning and treatment, how you work with lived materials, is a creative priority in the African diaspora. So think of quilting. This is another great example of it. If you're doing it more theoretically, you might call it bricolage or something else, but just the sheer act of quilting is sufficient as an example. You take already existing fabrics, you reposition them and build an entirely new artifact/creative product. So 1 is technology, 2 is a rich tradition of the idea of sampling. Do you see what I'm getting at? The principle of sampling long predates it. How many times did you listen to Louis Armstrong and he's singing his own composition and in the middle will burst into some Cole Porter song? What, he just ran out of material? Not exactly. He wants to quote this song. He's sampling it without the record because he wants to say something and he wants to convey it in conversation, because dialogical terms are so important in black music around the world, to be in conversation, and this process produces an immediate conversation. And the third piece has to do with this, the third signature piece has to do with thinking about and this is where things get a little less cheerful. I'd like to give you a warning. How much decline and despair takes place in urban America after pretty much the mid-1960s, and how that despair and frustration and disregard begins to manifest itself in increasingly limited economic opportunities, and the way that becomes, for the very beginning of hip-hop, a source of creativity. So let me explain that. Number one, the vast majority of the innovators were, for the first 10 years or so, were mostly on the musical side, not the lyricists, but the ones doing this musical technology piece. They were in vocational tech schools. They were tracked into dead-end vocational tech schools, jobs, and careers. So someone like DJ Red Alert, who, yes, is older than me, went to a school to do what? Sort of drafting. 5 years before, drafting went completely computer tech. No one does hand drafting anymore. I mean, it was, so they sent all people to do sort of technological or stereo repair. Half of them were stereo repair kids. They were not going to general ed school so they would get good grades to go to Brown. They were sent to vocational tech school so that they could go get a nice working class job in a career that most often simply was not going to exist anymore. These were not high-tech training jobs. These were low-tech jobs, repairmen for the most part. So all the original sort of DJs who built their own equipment knew the equipment inside and out. Why? Because they were being trained to repair. Exactly. So like, oh, I know how to fix it, and I actually know how to entirely rebuild it. So I'm just going to completely rebuild it and let it do what I want it to do. So at the same time, this is not a profitable thing, but it is about how a dead end, a space is made out of a dead end, right? An avenue is made out of a dead end. Now, this is a very romantic story about early hip-hop that I'm telling, because I'm emphasizing all of the creativity and I'm emphasizing all of the ways in which these traditions create possibility and open up exchange. But that's not all that's going on in that era. It's also a profoundly destructive period of time for Black America. And frankly, we haven't quite dug out of what really takes place after the 1960s in terms of what urban theorists would call urban renewal, which really it was not. It was a sort of reclaiming of certain spaces and the sheer destruction of what were already very fragile communities. I don't have time to talk to you about how northern, particularly urban cities, ghettos became really the new symbol of the crisis of segregation and racial discrimination. And they continue to stand as these incredible examples of what's not happening and what's not being lived up to. And yet we simply have no capacity to talk about it in a meaningful and structural way in the culture now. So in that space, which is where hip hop is born, you have immigrant, multiracial, multinational Black exchanges, lots of Caribbean influences, lots of traditional sort of African-American Southern migrants, great-great-grandchildren, who work together to create this profoundly dynamic musical form, but it's also about expressing an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of anger, and an awful lot of just on the borderline of what Cornel West would call nihilism, right? This borderline of, I'm not quite not gonna make it, but it's really awfully close. So for the first 15 years, that's as far as it goes, pretty much. It doesn't say, I'm never gonna make it, I'm not gonna make it, it's not gonna work. You might have moments of it's not gonna work, but something always pulls you out. Well, that's because really, Black people in the modern world developed an obsession with a narrative of possibility, because it would be completely impossible to survive 400 years of this particular formation of slavery, because it's not just slavery that had to be survived. People have been surviving that for a long time. But the particular way that racialized slavery takes place in North America is so profoundly psychologically destructive that the use of both religious and other spiritual mechanisms to turn every story around, and this, you see this in the music so all over the place. I mean, I was just in the car, I was like, oh, there's another example. It's like one of those things you just see all the time to say, yes, it's completely impossible, but something will work out. Something's gonna happen. You see it in the narrative of Black churches all the time. The music continued that tradition for a very long time.